rye versus wheat trial. I started talking to Blake a little bit about this, Dave, earlier when we were offline. So did you read that one, the rye versus wheat, where they're finally explaining why rye is so much better for diabetic and glucose maintenance?
Yeah, it's very fascinating, and it brings to mind that there are different characteristics in the grains that we eat, because I think, if I understand correctly, that study compared whole grain wheat to whole grain rye, and we say, hey, all grains are the same, but maybe they're not, and
No,
so
and this is the fiber differentiation. This is the targeted prebiotics conversation that we were getting into, because rye is targeting Bifidobacterium adolescentis, right? Which is a very specific bifido. And so I'm reading this, it reduced CRP by 17%. That's a systemic inflammation marker. So now we're looking at, okay, that bifido, that specific species, is linked to better glucose tolerance. This is an example of a very targeted prebiotic fiber differentiation between the two. This is when we start talking about, okay, there is a reason for fiber diversity. It is not about fiber maxing and going and buying your can of Metamucil and drinking as much of it in one day as possible. It is about making sure you have enough diversity out of the natural world to resync the body through the microbiome, right?
yeah. Well, and as I look at the study, there is a difference between the groups. So the rye group had about 30 grams a day of fiber, whereas the wheat group only had about 8 grams a day.
Ooh, I missed
So,
that.
so,
I didn't read
so
that.
that difference of obviously the amount of fiber, and the daily value is around 25, 28 grams. So many people don't even get there. And so,
The
yeah,
blue
but
zone people eat much more than that. That's a drop in the bucket to most of the blues.
Yeah, and you know as well as I do that actually fiber specificity now and affinity for taxes, the new big thing that's being looked at. There's not one type, there's not two, there's not 10. It turns out there might be 30, 50, a million. I'm saying a million with hyperbole there, okay? I don't know that, but there's definitely more than 20.
Well, we never considered polyphenols as
well, and to your point, so I just want to jump on this because it ties together what you were actually saying, is that in whole grain products, actually 60 to 80% of that fiber is non-extractable polyphenols, or the other word for that is fiber-bound polyphenols.
Right.
They don't get processed until the colon.
Right.
And one of the reasons they're processed there is actually to offset the risk that you get in the colon of protein fermentation, which can have a toxic side to it. So that's why those polyphenols and that fiber are delivered there. It's like, once you start to look into this, you're like, man, I mean, my spiritual and religious experience is kind of non-institutional, if I can put it that way. But I'm left thinking to myself, there's an awful lot of coordination going on here, either from time at scale or from I'm more of an idealist now, so I believe consciousness is fundamental, so everything is connected. Something is coordinating some of this stuff, because and we're just so short-sighted and linear that we're just starting to pick up on this stuff now. Like, food is pretty badass. Our digestive system's pretty badass. Like, the fact that it does all these crazy, sophisticated, nonlinear things, it just blows my mind.
yeah, and it's really interesting to think about the effects of phenolics and the role of them in our gut. So, our gut is this tank where a lot of oxidation and a lot of kind of waste products are happening. And so, the phenolics are protected, but when you're refining the grain, when you're taking out the fiber, well, that's taking out the things that are protecting us from the downside of digestion. But yeah, the idea of the type of fiber really matters too. We have insoluble, which is, it doesn't provide food for our microbiome, versus the soluble and the fermentable fiber. And so when we compare different forms of fiber, we see differences among them. I'm working on a project for Prickly Pear, based on a USDA grant, and they're coming up with a research strategy. And really, a lot of it, the traditional use of consumption of cactus and prickly pear leaf, especially in Mexico, is really tied to the health benefit.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
That's the
yeah. And so, there's a whole research project around, defining what is in cactus that makes it so healthy, And we find that, yeah, it has these phenolics and it has minerals, and it's kind of this, well, botanical whole food thing.
And it has a mucilaginous protective effect.
Yeah. Even when you compare it to, say, psyllium husk, or, soluble fiber from psyllium husk, you're likely to see, beneficial differences from this more natural, fiber. And
I mean,
yeah,
you're talking about another class of prebiotics, targeted prebiotic. And so when you combine all of those properties, that makes it almost, well, in the Mexican traditional diet, it is a superfood. They didn't go without it. That was used everywhere, right? It is a technical superfood. I know that in the US, we've looked at apples in the past and labeled it as a superfruit for many reasons. And there is reason to revisit it. We just don't care as much because apples also have pectins and fibers and all the other components, but it's I think it's a multi-delivery system in its natural whole state. That is the effect, which helps start a lot of this early conversation, helped start that whole food movement. If you think about that, the whole foods diets and not the store, but the whole foods consumption movement, which now, how many years does it go back, Blake and Dave? I mean, it's got to be over 40, 50 years ago that they started talking about that, not including the Kellogg's times from the 1800s. But
yeah, Nutrilite has been around since the 40s, and that was always based around whole food.